Welcome to the realm of science fiction, where imagination knows no bounds and extraordinary stories unfold. Enjoy the adventure.
Aaron Rhea stood on the edge of the balcony, looking out at the surreal landscape of Netherrack 5. Below him, the massive, gravity-defying structures of the Vathari capital towered above the glowing ridges that spanned the void between floating platforms. The city, a wonder of alien technology, shimmered under the twin moons, their soft light reflecting off the smooth, metallic surfaces of the buildings. But despite the awe-inspiring sight, Aaron felt the weight of isolation pressing down on him. He had been on this alien world for years, tasked with a diplomatic mission to bring peace between humanity and the Vathari. Yet every day he felt more like an outsider. He was human, in a land where humans were an afterthought, a species that barely mattered in the grand scheme of the Vathari Empire. He had come to negotiate, to build trust, but in his heart, he knew that the gulf between them, cultural, emotional, and ideological, was unbridgeable. The Vathari were everything humanity was not: regal, imposing, and deeply proud of their ancient traditions. Their towering forms, covered in ceremonial armor, moved through the city like living statues, perfectly attuned to the power and codes of honor that governed their existence. To the Vathari, strength was everything: strength in mind, strength in body, strength in will. And Aaron? He was a stranger in a world where power was measured not by intelligence or empathy, but by how fiercely one could wield control. He had once believed in the idea of diplomacy, the belief that dialogue could overcome all barriers. But standing on the balcony now, as the city below hummed with an energy that felt both familiar and foreign, he realized how naive that belief had been. The more he learned about the Vathari, the more he understood that their idea of strength had no place for the values he held dear. In their world, compassion was a weakness, and compromise was seen as an act of betrayal. As a diplomat, Aaron had been trained to adapt, to navigate the complexities of negotiation with precision. But there was a part of him, the human part, that rebelled against the cold, calculating nature of the Vathari. He had seen too many acts of cruelty, too many lives appended in the name of maintaining control. The Vathari's way of life was not his own, and it would never be. Yet, despite all the ways they differed, Aaron found himself inexplicably drawn to them. It was not their traditions or their rigid code of honor that fascinated him. It was the way they saw the universe: vast, indifferent, and driven by the unrelenting pursuit of power. And as much as he loathed that view, part of him admired it. The Vathari had built an empire that spanned across the stars, one that had never known defeat, and Aaron couldn't help but wonder how they had done it. They were a species that understood survival in a way humans could only dream of, and that realization made him question his place in the galaxy. But it also reminded him of his own people, the ones he had left behind. Humanity was weak, fragile, still struggling to find its place among the stars. Aaron had once believed that humanity could rise to greatness, but now, standing here on a foreign world, he wasn't so sure anymore. The Vathari had forged, and now, empire through blood and steel. While humans were still trying to find their footing. As the night deepened, Aaron's mind turned to the task ahead. He was here to negotiate, to bring peace, but his own heart wavered. Could he continue to serve the Vathari when every instinct told him they were wrong? Was it even possible to be loyal to a people so different from his own? And more than that, could he maintain his humanity in a world that saw weakness in everything he valued? He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to retreat into the shadows. His loyalty to humanity was unwavering, but in this world, where the Vathari reigned supreme, loyalty seemed like an illusion, a fleeting dream that would never survive in the face of true power. For the first time in his life, Aaron Rhea found himself questioning everything. The city below seemed both beautiful and oppressive, a mirror to the emotions roiling inside him. He was a diplomat, yes, but he was also a man caught between two worlds, unsure which one would break him first. The Vathari Empire had always stood as a pillar of power, an unassailable force in the galaxy. Its golden age had been long, marked by towering structures that scraped the sky, vast cities that floated above the gas giants, and technologies that humans could scarcely dream of. But now, the very foundations of that empire trembled. The once imposing imperial palace, floating among the clouds, seemed almost fragile in the quiet starlight. The gleaming platforms that connected it to the rest of the city, once symbols of eternal strength, now felt like delicate glass suspended in the infinite expanse of space. It was a world on the brink of something. But whether it was rebirth or ruin, No one could yet say in the shadow of this monumental decay, the city's streets still pulsed with life, but there was an underlying unease in the air. The Vathari, once united in their belief of absolute strength and order, were now divided. The grandeur of their past seemed to mock them as whispers of rebellion became louder, echoing through the palace halls. The very power that had once held their society together now seemed to be slipping through their fingers, like sand through the cracks of an ancient foundation. Aaron Rhea could feel it, the change in the atmosphere. The Vathari's once unshakable confidence had faltered. Their mighty empire, built on the backs of its rigid traditions, had been struck by the first tremors of its inevitable collapse. The Vathari themselves, imposing and proud, walked with their heads high, yet there was a cloud of doubt that now clung to them. Their strength, their empire, was starting to show its age, and the cracks in their armor were widening. It had all started, so perfectly, an unbreakable bond between the humans and the Vathari. Aaron had come to Nithrak 5 as a humble diplomat, tasked with bridging the gap between their species, but now he saw the truth behind the Empire's magnificence. Beneath the polished metal, beneath the grand architecture and advanced technologies, lay a system that was failing. And with its decline, the personal conflict that had been brewing inside, Aaron was growing stronger by the day. He had once believed in the Empire's vision, had even admired the Vathari for their resolve, their unyielding strength. But now, he found himself questioning everything. The Empire had become a gilded cage, one where dissent was punished and weakness had no place. And yet, the truth that Aaron had uncovered truths about betrayal, manipulation, and ruthless control left him feeling like an outsider in a world he once respected. The palace, once a shining symbol of the Vathari's might, had begun to lose its luster. Its advanced technologies, once the envy of the galaxy, were no longer enough to quell the simmering rebellion that was spreading across the Empire. The Vathari had once been able to control everything with an iron fist, but now their grip was slipping. The air was thick with whispers of factions rising up, of a revolution that could tear apart everything they had built. Aaron couldn't help but feel the weight of these changes pressing on him. He had come to Nithrak 5 to forge peace, to work with the Vathari, to build something better for humanity. But now he saw the cracks in their empire, the weakness that lay at its heart. And worse still, he was caught in the middle of it all, torn between his duty to humanity and his growing admiration for the strength of the Vathari. Aaron knew that something had to change. The Empire was on the brink, and so too was Aaron. He could feel it in every whispered conversation, in every discontented murmur that echoed through the palace corridors. The Vathari were no longer the impenetrable force they had once been. The weight of their power had become a burden, and this golden age they had once celebrated now felt like a distant memory. The Empire was teetering on the edge, and no one knew which way it would fall. But Aaron knew one thing for certain: the decline of the Vathari Empire was inevitable. Whether that meant the end of their reign or the beginning of something new, he couldn't yet say. But as the city around him seemed to vibrate with the pulse of uncertainty, Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to be swept up in the storm that was coming. The Vathari were strong, undeniably strong, but even the mightiest of empires could not stand forever. The cracks were there, and they were widening. Aaron Rhea would soon have to choose which side of this shifting world he would stand on. The fall of the Vathari Empire was coming, and with it, the dawn of something new, something both terrifying and awe-inspiring was about to unfold. Aaron Rhea felt the weight of the universe on his shoulders as he made his way through the winding, opulent corridors of the Vathari Palace. The walls, alive with soft pulses of energy, seemed to hum with an otherworldly resonance, as if they were attuned to the very will of the Empire. The air was thick with the faint scent of incense, the atmosphere heavy with the power of the place. Everything here, every shimmering surface, every flickering light spoke of unyielding dominance, of an empire that had stood for eons and had crushed everything in its path. He could feel it now, more than ever before, the suffocating weight of his position. He was a diplomat, yes, but he was also a pawn in a game he was just beginning to understand. The Vathari might have extended an olive branch to humanity, but Aaron had come to realize that the hand beneath the olive branch was one of iron, masked by smooth words and false promises. The true strength of the Vathari Empire lay not in its technology or its grand cities, but in its ability to control and manipulate, to bring all things under its heel. And at the heart of that power stood Queen Ilara. As Aaron's boots echoed against the polished floor, a sense of dread gnawed at him. He knew why he had been summoned. It was not for diplomacy, not for peace. The Queen's call was one of power of command, and it carried with it a weight he couldn't escape. Her presence, even from a distance, demanded reverence, but there was more than that. A deep, unsettling fear crept up Aaron's spine as he approached the chamber doors. The doors opened silently before him, the threshold crossing into a world where power reigned supreme. Queen Ilara's chamber was a place of eerie calm, a perfect reflection of her rule. The space was vast, yet intimate, with walls that pulsed with a strange energy, casting shifting shadows on the cold, black floors. Holograms hovered in the air, displaying star maps of her empire, and energy conduits ran along the ceiling, vibrating with the pulse of the Vathari's technological might. Yet there was a stillness here, a quiet, almost oppressive stillness, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Perhaps Aaron thought it was waiting for him. At the far end of the room, seated on a throne of polished obsidian, was Queen Ilara herself. She sat as a monument to her empire, tall, regal, with an aura of cold elegance that filled the space like a tangible force. Her armor, intricately carved with glowing symbols of her lineage, radiated power, but it was her eyes, her piercing, unyielding gaze, that held the greatest weight. Those eyes, deep and calculating, seemed to see through Aaron, as though she could read the very fabric of his soul. "Approach, Aaron Rhea," she commanded, her voice a smooth, unwavering melody that carried the authority of the stars themselves. There was no warmth in her tone, no hint of personal connection, only the cold certainty of a ruler who had no need to ask for respect, for she knew it was owed to her. Aaron's heart raced as he stepped forward, each footfall a step deeper, into a world he had never fully understood, a world where every action was a calculation, every word a piece of a much larger puzzle. He stopped before her, his eyes drawn to the imposing figure before him, yet despite the power she exuded, Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something hidden beneath the armor of control. There was a vulnerability, a loneliness in the way she regarded him, a brief flicker that disappeared as quickly as it came. "You have done well," she continued, her voice cold but not unkind. "Your efforts to bridge the gap between our peoples have not gone unnoticed. And now I would offer you a position, one of great power." Aaron's chest tightened as the words hung in the air. He had come here with the hope of peace, to negotiate, to mediate. But this was something else entirely. This was a call to loyalty, a demand that he pledge himself to her, to the Vathari Empire, to the very force that had subjugated countless worlds. His mind raced, torn between the duty he felt to his people and the gravity of what she was offering. He could feel the temptation. It was unmistakable. The promise of power, the chance to stand beside her as her equal, to become part of something vast, something that spanned the stars themselves. But at what cost? Her gaze never wavered from him, her eyes like twin stars, watching, measuring. "You will be at my side, Aaron. You will help shape the future of this empire, a future that will echo across the galaxy. But to do so, you must give your loyalty. Unyielding and complete. There is no room for doubt, no room for hesitation." The weight of her words pressed down on him. He knew what she was asking, knew what it would mean to accept. To pledge himself to her would mean forsaking his own people, his own values. It would mean becoming part of something he had once despised, something that had shattered so many lives. Yet in this room, with her staring down at him, so sure, so confident in her own power, the decision seemed impossibly difficult. "I cannot," Aaron said, his voice low but steady. His eyes held hers, and for a brief moment, he saw something flicker, something that wasn't power, wasn't command, but a flash of something deeper. Was it hope? Or perhaps a loneliness that mirrored his own? The Queen's gaze hardened, but she said nothing. There was a brief, tense silence between them, filled only with the hum of the energy coursing through the room. Aaron stood tall, despite the weight of the decision pressing on his chest. The room felt suffocating, the space between them impossibly vast. Yet in that silence, he knew that he had made the right choice. The loyalty she sought was not one he could give. Not to her, not to the Vathari, not at the cost of his own humanity. As the Queen looked at him, her expression unreadable, Aaron knew that his time on Nitharak 5 was rapidly running out. The world he had come to know was slipping away, and the rebellion that had been quietly building in the shadows, was about to come to a head. But even as the weight of the coming storm pressed down on him, Aaron found clarity. In that moment, he might be a diplomat, a servant to peace, but he would not be a slave to power. The Queen could offer him everything, but he knew that true loyalty had to come from within. And in this room, in the heart of the Vathari Empire, Aaron Rhea was choosing to remain human. Aaron's hands gripped the cold railing of the balcony, the distant hum of the palace vibrating beneath his feet. He had spent months among the Vathari, navigating the complexities of diplomacy, but lately, each passing day felt like a betrayal of his own beliefs. The silence that now stretched between his thoughts seemed to reflect the vastness of the empire he had grown to fear. He had once believed that peace could be forged through dialogue, that understanding could be achieved despite their differences. But as he watched the Vathari court operate, he couldn't shake the truth that had become undeniable. This was not a people who valued peace. They valued power. And he was nothing but a small pawn in a game he no longer understood. The grand halls of the palace stretched out before him, a labyrinth of intricate alien technology and towering statues that loomed like silent sentinels. Each step he took echoed through the long corridors, where the walls pulsed with soft, eerie lights energy conduits that hummed with the power he could feel in his chest. Everything about the palace spoke of dominance. The walls were adorned with tapestries depicting the history of the Vathari, their conquests, their glory. The art was stunning, yet it was laced with an unsettling truth. The Vathari had always ruled through force, through fear, through their unwavering belief in their superiority. As Aaron walked through the corridors, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had come to Nithrak 5 with the hope of bridging a gap between two species, but now, every glance from the Vathari court, every whisper that passed between their ranks, only confirmed what he had begun to fear. They saw him as an outsider, a tool to be used, a token of their supposed goodwill to the humans, but never as an equal. He was the only human among them, the only one who had the privilege of seeing their empire up close, and the longer he stayed, the more the truth gnawed at him. The Vathari were not interested in cooperation. They were interested in control. Their grand gestures of diplomacy were nothing more than a facade to mask the brutal reality of their rule. It was in the court that Aaron truly felt the weight of this truth. The Vathari court was like a machine perfectly designed, endlessly efficient, but without room for humanity. Every word, every gesture was scrutinized, weighed for its value in the pursuit of dominance. Their codes of honor were strict, unforgiving, and utterly foreign to Aaron's sense of justice. To them, strength was the only virtue worth having. The weak were discarded, their voices silenced in the face of the Empire's unrelenting force. The Queen's rule was absolute, and her methods? Ruthless. Aaron had witnessed it firsthand. The eradication of dissidents, the manipulation of the people, the cold calculation behind every political move. The unease that had simmered within him since his arrival now threatened to boil over. He had once admired the Vathari for their strength, their discipline, but the longer he observed them, the more their methods sickened him. They were brilliant, yes, but they were also cruel. And the closer Aaron got to the center of their empire, the more he realized how little room there was for mercy, for compassion, for anything that resembled the values he had been raised with. His role as a diplomat meant to bridge the gap between humanity and this mighty empire felt increasingly like an act of self-deception. How could he represent his people in a world where the very concept of diplomacy was a lie? His discomfort had become a constant companion. At first, it had been a whisper at the back of his mind, easily drowned out by the excitement of his mission. But now it was a roar, one he couldn't ignore. The longer he spent among the Vathari, the more the distance between their values and his own widened. It was becoming harder to justify his presence here, to tell himself that this was for the greater good. The rebellion, quiet but growing stronger with every passing day, was proof of the cracks in the empire. And yet, despite all of it, Aaron found himself drawn deeper into their world. There was something magnetic about the Vathari's vision of strength, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about power and survival. But that attraction came at a cost that had begun to weigh heavily on him. As he continued through the palace, he could feel the eyes of the Vathari court upon him. They weren't watching with curiosity or interest. They were watching for weakness. They were watching because they had no trust in him. And perhaps, in a way, that was what troubled him most of all. He had come to Nithrak 5 with the hope of forging connections, of finding a way to bring peace. But here, in the heart of the empire, he felt more isolated than ever. Aaron paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the long hallway ahead. The walls, lined with holographic displays of ancient Vathari victories, seemed to stretch on forever. The energy pulsing through the room seemed to vibrate with an unspoken command, one that he could feel deep in his bones. He was an outsider. Here, and no matter how much he tried to adapt, no matter how much he tried to understand their ways, he would never truly belong. He had been caught in the gears of a machine too vast and too powerful to be influenced by one diplomat. But that realization, that the very act of peacemaking had become a farce, was more crushing than anything he had ever expected. The tension that had been building within him for weeks finally reached its breaking point. He could no longer justify his role here. He could no longer stand by and pretend that the Vathari's methods, their brutal efficiency, were something he could accept. His mission, once so clear, now felt like an impossible task. How could he represent a people who stood for everything the Vathari opposed? How could he act as an envoy of peace when the empire he was supposed to engage with had no interest in peace? And so, as the palace stretched out before him, full of its looming power and unyielding authority, Aaron Rhea realized that he had reached a crossroads. The path he had been walking, the one that had brought him here to Netherrack 5, was no longer the path he could continue on. He had a choice to make. Would he comply? Would he bend to the will of the Empire and become one more tool in their quest for control? Or would he rebel and risk everything to follow a moral compass that might very well be the undoing of everything he had worked for? The answer was not yet clear, but the first stirrings of rebellion had already begun within him. The silent struggle had become a battle for his very soul. Aaron stood at the threshold of a new world, one where the stakes had never been higher. The weight of the task before him pressed down like the vast sky above, suffocating in its enormity. He had been summoned by Queen Ilara herself, the figure who wielded power over an empire that spanned the stars, and she had tasked him with a role unlike any he had imagined. A simple diplomat, thrust into the heart of a galaxy-shaking conflict. The request was not merely a political maneuver. It was a call to action, one that would alter the fates of both humanity and the Vathari. Queen Ilara's voice had echoed through his thoughts, her words clear and sharp, each syllable heavy with authority. "You will negotiate with the rebels," she had said. "Their influence grows, and their goals are unclear. You will represent my will. Fail, and we risk losing control over the Vathari Empire. Succeed, and you will solidify my rule. You will secure humanity's place among the stars." Her gaze had been unflinching, a command that left no room for refusal. The Vathari Empire was at a crossroads, and Aaron had just been given the key to either stabilize or fracture it further. He knew little about the rebels, only that they had gained significant power, and the city of Netherrack 5 was on the brink of civil unrest. Rumors whispered of factions rising, of power struggles that were no longer just confined to the corridors of the palace. Every conversation he overheard, in the marketplace or in the palace halls, seemed tinged with the scent of rebellion. The city was alive with anticipation, and its fate hung in the balance. But there was more at play here than just diplomacy. Aaron felt it in his gut. The air itself felt charged, and every passing day in the Vathari capital seemed to magnify the tension that had been building for years. The rebellion was no longer an abstract concept. It had teeth now. It wasn't simply a political movement. It was a force that could change the course of history. And his actions, his decisions in these next few days, would either reinforce the Queen's dominance or tip the scales in favor of the rebels. Aaron couldn't shake the weight of the decision he was about to make, the negotiation he was about to embark on was not just about securing peace or prolonging the Queen's reign. It was about trust about which side he would stand on when the rebellion finally erupted. He had spent years learning the Vathari ways, understanding their rigid systems, their codes of honor. But those codes, as firm as they seemed, were beginning to crack under the pressure of rebellion. The empire was fracturing. The people were no longer as obedient as they once were, and Aaron had to decide if he would continue to support a regime built on fear and control, or if he would stand with the rebels and help tear down the empire that had once seemed so invincible. The tension was palpable, gnawing at his every thought. The future of the galaxy was in his hands, yet his loyalty was at war with itself. His allegiance to humanity, the people he had sworn to protect, clashed with his growing understanding of the Vathari. He had seen their strength, their tenacity, their brilliance. Could he really betray them? Could he betray Queen Ilara, the woman who had made him believe that peace was possible? the rebels, shadowy figures lurking in the dark corners of the Kai's city, had their own plans that, if successful, would forever alter the balance of power. Their goals were unclear, but their influence was undeniable. They had made strides, gaining support among the people. The city's undercurrent of unrest was undeniable, and Aaron knew that whatever he did, it would shape the future. Either he would stand by the Queen and continue her oppressive rule, or he would aid the rebels, embracing the possibility of chaos and change. But it wasn't just the politics of it that gnawed at him. There was a personal struggle too, one that transcended diplomacy. In every negotiation, every glance, Aaron had begun to see a different side to Queen Ilara. She was not just a ruler, not just a cold figure of unyielding strength. She had shown him glimpses of vulnerability, of a mind that was not only capable of ruthless decisions, but also capable of doubt. Did she truly believe in her empire, or was she trapped by it? Did she know what the cost of her reign had been? And then there were the rebels. Could he trust them? Their promises of a new order seemed enticing, but were they any better than the empire they sought to overthrow? Aaron had seen enough in his time among the Vathari to understand that the desire for power, whether under a monarchy or a rebellion, was never as pure as it seemed. But he couldn't ignore the possibility that a new world might be possible, one that didn't operate on the foundation of fear and oppression. The weight of the decision pressed against him, the consequences of his actions reverberating in his mind. He could not remain neutral. The tension was too high, the stakes too great. He would have to choose a side, and in doing so, he would define the future of two species. The rebellion was no longer a distant possibility. It was a growing storm, and Aaron was at its eye. The choice he made now would determine not only the fate of the Vathari Empire, but also the future of humanity. The negotiation was his chance to tip the scales, but it was also his chance to decide what kind of man he wanted to be, a diplomat bound by duty, or a leader forged by the fires of rebellion. And so, as the whispers of rebellion grew louder, Aaron Rhea knew that his next step would lead him into the heart of the Vathari Empire's greatest conflict, one that could change the galaxy forever. The time for words had passed. It was now. Time for action. The tension between Aaron and Queen Ilara simmered just beneath the surface, an invisible thread that grew tighter with every passing moment. He had always been a man of diplomacy, a negotiator by trade, yet in her presence, the rules he had adhered to for so long began to crumble. His mind constantly told him to keep his distance, to remain focused on his mission and his loyalty to humanity. But his heart betrayed him, drawing him deeper into a situation he had never imagined. At first, it had been subtle small. Moments where their conversations veered into personal territory, where their eyes met just a little longer than they should have. It was always fleeting, always masked by the demands of empire, but in those moments, Aaron saw something in Ilara that no one else did. Beneath the ironclad authority that cloaked her every word and action, there was a vulnerability, a deep loneliness, an untold sorrow that echoed in her voice when she spoke of the Empire's unrelenting demands. She had shared fragments of her past with him, rare moments when the mask slipped, when she wasn't the queen, but just a woman, one who had been shaped by the crushing weight of duty and power. There was no one else, it seemed, who had ever seen this side of her. She was the ruler of the Vathari, a being of unimaginable strength, yet in those fleeting, private moments with Aaron, she seemed human again, vulnerable, complex, and strangely open. Aaron found himself captivated. It wasn't just the political intrigue, nor the sense of duty that bound him to her. It was the growing connection, the understanding that began to bloom in his chest. The line between loyalty to his people and the feelings that had started to surface for Ilara blurred, becoming increasingly difficult to differentiate. The complexity of it all was overwhelming. On one hand, there was the duty he owed to humanity, reason he had come to Netherrack 5 in the first place. The Vathari had been a threat, an imperial force too dangerous to ignore, and his task had always been clear: ensure humanity's survival by forging an alliance, or if necessary, prepare for confrontation. Yet here he was, on the verge of something else entirely, a relationship he knew he couldn't afford, but couldn't escape. Ilara's words, at times so sharp and calculating, now held moments of something softer. Their discussions, once purely political, had started to touch on deeper themes, her fears, her uncertainties. They were no longer simply the queen and the diplomat. In these rare exchanges, they were two individuals, caught in a world too vast. for either of them to fully understand. She spoke once, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "There are parts of this empire, parts of me, Aaron, that no one understands. Not even my own people." It had been a simple statement, yet it reverberated in Aaron's mind long after she had spoken it. She had never allowed herself to be vulnerable like this before. Never. Let anyone see the cracks in her armor. For a moment, she seemed not like the empress of a galaxy-spanning empire, but just a woman burdened by the weight of expectations. It was in that instant that Aaron realized how deep her isolation truly went, and how far he had already fallen into the pull of her orbit. The pull was undeniable now, and it scared him. He had tried to resist. He had tried to focus on the mission, on the alliance that could change everything for humanity. But Ilara was not just a queen. She was a woman struggling with her own demons, trying to maintain control over a crumbling empire while still grappling with the remnants of her humanity. But it was a dangerous thing, this bond between them. He could see it now, clearer than ever, the way her vulnerability bled into his thoughts, how her influence seeped into his heart. She was the one who had summoned him here, the one whose power shaped everything. Yet in these rare, fleeting moments, she was the one who needed him, who sought him out in ways she never let anyone else see. The tension between them, both personal and political, was unbearable. The more they shared these quiet moments, the more the distance between loyalty and affection blurred. Every word, every glance carried weight, and every encounter pulled him deeper into a web he could not untangle. He began to question everything. What did it mean to be loyal to a ruler who, in her private moments, seemed just as broken as the empire she commanded? What did it mean to love someone who could never truly allow themselves to be loved? Someone bound by a duty that left no room for weakness? Aaron's resolve was slipping. He knew that this bond, whatever it was becoming, was forbidden. It was a connection that threatened to undermine everything he had come to understand about duty, about loyalty. And yet, in the quiet of their shared moments, he found himself unable to walk away. His heart ached as he struggled with the dilemma. The woman before him, strong, powerful, but shattered in her own way, was no simple political figure. She was the very embodiment of the empire he had been sent to deal with. But now, in his mind, she was becoming something more. A person. A person he could not ignore. In the depths of his conflict, he found something unexpected, the dawning realization that he might not be the only one struggling with this. Perhaps, just as he was drawn to her, she too had become tangled in the complexity of their relationship. Yet, as the days passed, the weight of their bond grew heavier. The line between duty and desire grew blurrier, and Aaron knew that this was no longer just a diplomatic mission. He was entangled in something far deeper, something that threatened to change the course of his life, and possibly the fate of humanity itself. The forbidden nature of their connection made it all the more dangerous, and Aaron was no fool. He knew that this could not end well, but there was no escaping it now. The ties that bound them had already been forged. The moment Aaron stepped into the chamber, he felt the weight of the Vathari Empire pressing down upon him. The air was thick, heavy with the palpable presence of Queen Ilara. The room, an imposing fusion of ancient power and futuristic technology, pulsed with an unnatural energy. Soft, glowing lights illuminated the walls, revealing intricate alien designs etched into the surfaces, symbols of a long-standing reign, each one a testament to the strength and control of the Vathari. The hum of energy fields filled the silence, a constant reminder of the Empire's technological supremacy. Aaron's eyes caught the faint flicker of holographic displays, images of war, unrest, and the fractured territories that lay beyond the Queen's reach. The rebellion was growing, and Ilara was determined to stamp it out, no matter the cost. The images shifted, showcasing the precision and destruction of the Vathari military. The power of the Empire, once invincible, was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Aaron felt a chill crawl up his spine as the truth of his situation settled in. This wasn't just diplomacy anymore. This was a test of loyalty, one that would define the future of both humanity and the Vathari. Queen Ilara stood in the center of the room, her presence dominating everything around her. Her figure was tall and elegant, draped in ceremonial armor that gleamed with dark, reflective surfaces. There was a coldness in the way she held herself, a sense of authority that came from years of unchallenged rule. She was a queen in every sense of the word, formidable, commanding, and utterly confident in her power. Yet beneath that confidence, Aaron could sense something deeper, something vulnerable, perhaps, but also dangerous. There was no room for weakness in this empire. and Ilara was not a woman who allowed any part of her to show fragility. As she fixed her gaze upon him, Aaron felt the full weight of her presence. It wasn't just the fear that her gaze instilled, it was the unspoken threat that came with it. To disobey her was to risk everything. The very future of the Vathari Empire and the balance between their two species hung on his response. She was not merely a ruler. She was the embodiment of the Empire's will, and that will was absolute. Aaron Rhea, her voice rang out, smooth yet hard as steel. You have done well in bringing your people to the table, but now your true loyalty will be tested. You will stand with me, or you will stand against the Empire. Your actions have consequences, and those consequences will shape the future. The word struck Aaron like a hammer. She had been subtle at first, using diplomacy as a veil for her deeper intentions, but now, standing before him, the truth was undeniable. His role was no longer one of simple negotiation. He was being asked to choose a choice that would either bind him to the Vathari or cast him aside as a traitor. The weight of her demands was suffocating, and as she stood there, with her piercing eyes locking onto his, he knew that any refusal would have dire consequences, not just for him, but for the fragile peace he had hoped to build. Inside, Aaron's mind raced. His diplomatic training had prepared him for many things: tough negotiations, delicate political alliances, even the occasional threat of violence. But this was different. This was an existential demand, one that struck at the core of who he was. He had come to Nithrak 5 with the hope of fostering cooperation between humanity and the Vathari, but now he was faced with a stark choice: abandon his values or comply with the will of a ruthless, unyielding empire. The morality of his decision began to weigh heavily on him. How could he serve such a regime, knowing the cost it would exact from him and from his people? The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken tension. He could feel his heartbeat quickening, the pressure mounting. Queen Ilara's gaze never wavered, her lips slightly parted as if waiting for the answer she already knew. In the face of her unwavering certainty, his own doubts seemed insignificant. His duty to humanity, to the people who had sent him here, flickered like a distant star, dwarfed by the force of her power. I expect no hesitation from you, Aaron, she continued, her voice becoming colder. Your loyalty is the only thing that matters now. You will lead with me, or you will lead against me. The choice is yours, but I will not wait long. Aaron's mind swirled with the enormity of the choice before him. His sense of duty to humanity screamed for him to resist, to reject the Vathari's oppressive rule. But the reality of his position, his isolation as the only human in the Vathari court, became undeniable. He was a lone diplomat in the midst of an empire that could crush him without a second thought. What was the cost of loyalty now? Was it truly worth risking everything, including his own soul, for a cause that seemed, in the grand scheme of things, so small? But then, there was the quiet realization that came to him: he was not powerless. He had made it this far, surviving, in the heart of an alien empire, negotiating his way through the dangers of a world not his own. There was strength in his humanity, a force that no empire, no queen, could fully comprehend. His adaptability, his ingenuity, these were the things that had kept him alive thus far. Could he afford to let them slip away now, to submit to a ruler whose methods were brutal, whose grip on power was ironclad? The walls of the chamber seemed to close in around him, the power of the Vathari Empire pressing down on his chest. And yet, as Ilara's gaze locked with his, something in him stirred. There was no easy choice here, no clear path forward. But, deep within him, a spark of defiance remained. His loyalty could not be bought, not even with the promise of power. Whatever came next, whether it led to peace, rebellion, or ruin, Aaron Rhea would face it as the man he had always been, not the pawn Ilara sought to make him. For now, the silence hung thick in the air. His choice had not yet been made, but the consequences of his decision would echo through the very foundations of the galaxy. The air was thick with tension as Aaron stood in the Queen's war chamber. The space, as grand and imposing as the Empire itself, was filled with holographic projections, detailed maps of the Empire, regions in revolt, and military outposts under siege. The sleek, deadly lines of Vathari warships hovered in the projections, poised like giant predators, waiting for the signal to strike. The room pulsed with a low hum of power, as if the very walls were alive, feeding on the Empire's violent need for control. Queen Ilara, standing at the center of the room, did not need to speak to command authority. It radiated from her. Her presence alone dominated everything. To her, weakness was a concept long eradicated from the Vathari lexicon, and Aaron, standing before her, was painfully aware of the chasm between them. His own values, grounded in the ideals of peace and diplomacy, felt foreign in this world of conquest and subjugation. The Vathari Empire was built on the strength of fear and domination, and now it was crumbling from within. Aaron, the Queen's voice broke the silence, sharp and calculating. You will join me in quelling the rebellion. The fate of the Empire depends on it. You will stand by my side and use your influence to keep the humans in line. The words sent a chill through Aaron's spine. What was once an honor to serve as a diplomat had now become a cage, each command more suffocating than the last. He had believed he could navigate the complexities of empire, but the more he saw of Ilara's methods, the more disgusted he became. The rebellion she spoke of was not merely a political faction. It was a cry for freedom, a desperate plea for change in a system that thrived on its own brutality. As she spoke, Aaron's thoughts spiraled. His loyalty to humanity, the people he had been sent here to protect, now conflicted with his increasing awareness of the Empire's true nature. He had prided himself on his ability to broker peace, but now he found himself caught in a web of manipulation and force. The Queen had asked for his loyalty, but he saw now that it was not just loyalty she sought, it was submission. His role had shifted. What was once a diplomatic mission had become a tool in her pursuit of power. The cold reality of the Queen's request forced Aaron to confront his moral compass. Was he, a diplomat who had pledged to build bridges between species, now nothing more than a pawn in her game of control? The weight of his duty to humanity seemed insignificant compared to the weight of what she was asking. His soul, his integrity, his very essence to bend to her will. The thought of it sickened him, but the stakes were too high to simply refuse. If the rebellion succeeded, humanity would be caught in the middle of a galaxy-wide war. If the Queen's grip on power slipped, it could lead to the collapse of everything. His gaze fell to the map before him, to the flashing red zones where rebellion burned hot, spreading like wildfire. This was more than a negotiation. It was a test. His values were in direct opposition to the Queen's methods. She was ruthless, with a single-mindedness that bordered on obsession. He knew the brutality of her forces. He had seen it with his own eyes, the executions, the imprisonments, the suppression of dissent. And now he was being asked to help her. Crush it all. The internal struggle grew unbearable, the tension tightening around him like a vice. He could not ignore the horrific things the Queen had done, the lives she had destroyed for the sake of maintaining her rule. But the idea of betraying the Vathari altogether, of throwing in his lot with the rebels, was just as unsettling. What was the cost of such a rebellion? Would it bring freedom or chaos? The weight of his decision pressed on him. He could either help maintain the status quo, aiding the Queen in her pursuit of power, or risk everything to stand against her, and possibly betray humanity's tenuous position. His values, which had always guided him, now seemed so fragile. In the face of such overwhelming force, days passed and the tension only deepened. Aaron found himself caught in the web of the Queen's manipulation. Her tactics were subtle, a mix of charm and command, but every interaction only blurred the line between loyalty and desire. Queen Ilara had begun to confide in him, sharing rare glimpses of her own doubts and fears, things she had never allowed anyone to see. At first, he had believed these moments were simply tools to manipulate him, but over time, Aaron found himself drawn to her vulnerability. She was not just the ruler of the Vathari Empire. She was a woman trapped in a system she could neither control nor fully escape. In the quiet moments between them, her ice-cold demeanor slipped, revealing cracks in her facade. And Aaron, who had always prided himself on understanding people, found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about power. She was ruthless, that was certain. But there was something about her, something undeniably magnetic. He could see why the Vathari had fallen behind her. Her intelligence, her ability to command, were unmatched. But those same traits made her dangerous. His internal conflict grew as he started to understand her more deeply, perhaps too deeply. She was not the monster he had once thought her to be, but nor was she the solution to the Empire's problems. He had to remind himself that her ambition was vast, her vision narrow, and her loyalty to the Empire came at the expense of everything else. Meanwhile, the rebellion grew bolder, and the Empire began to crack. Aaron saw the signs, the guerrilla warfare on the edge of the Empire-controlled territories. the stealthy sabotage of key infrastructure. The Vathari military responded with unmatched force, but the rebellion was not easily crushed. There was a fire in the people's hearts now, a fire that could not be extinguished by military might alone. For the first time, Aaron began to see the Empire through the eyes of the oppressed. The Vathari, despite their technological marvels, were not invulnerable. They were a people divided, ruled by fear, their strength held together by a brittle thread of control. The rebellion, though violent and dangerous, was not just a fight for power, it was a fight for something deeper, freedom. Aaron's heart wavered. Could he, in good conscience, continue to support a regime that would crush this fire? Could he stand by while people fought and died for their freedom, for a chance at a better life? The weight of the rebellion was now on his shoulders. If he sided with the Queen, he would be a traitor to his own humanity. But if he sided with the rebels, would he doom himself to a future of uncertainty and war? His resolve was weakening. He had never been more torn between duty and moral obligation, between loyalty to his people and a growing understanding of the Vathari's plight. The stakes were rising, and Aaron knew that his decision could tip the balance one way or the other. The line between loyalty and rebellion had become more blurred than ever, and soon he would have to choose. Aaron's internal battle reached its apex as he found himself alone with Queen Ilara again. The room was quiet, almost too quiet, as she spoke of the Empire's history, of the bloodshed and sacrifices that had built it. She was proud of what the Vathari had achieved, but there was a weariness in her voice, a hint of something far deeper than the ice-cold authority she projected to the outside world. Her power was not just political, it was cultural. The Vathari's rigid hierarchy, their system of dominance, ran through every facet of their society. Strength was revered, and weakness was discarded. Their entire way of life was a machine efficient, beautiful, and terrifying. Yet, despite all their might, Aaron saw the cracks. The system that had created such an empire was unsustainable. He could feel it in the way the people whispered behind closed doors, in the way the Vathari's own military was beginning to question their rule. It was this realization that forced Aaron to confront his deepest beliefs. His ideals of democracy, of justice, were rooted in a world where power was shared, where the weak had a voice. But here, power was an absolute. It was a concept that chilled him to his core. He couldn't reconcile his sense of justice with the Vathari's belief in domination. The gap between his values and theirs had never seemed so wide. His growing affection for Ilara complicated everything. There was a part of him that understood the burdens of leadership, the weight of being the last line of defense for an empire. But as much as he wanted to believe in her, he knew that the system she upheld was a lie, and no matter how human she appeared in private, she was still the one responsible for the pain and suffering of millions. The tension between them, once based on duty and politics, now felt like an emotional battlefield. Aaron was caught between two worlds, the ideals he had spent his life protecting, and the brutal reality of the empire he had come to know. The line between right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, honor and weakness had never been so blurred. Magnetic pull between Aaron and Ilara had grown undeniable, yet it was dangerous, a bond that threatened everything. In the quiet moments between them, the tension in the air was electric, charged with an energy that neither of them could ignore. Aaron's heart raced each time their paths crossed, each moment lingering longer than necessary, every glance filled with a new weight. But with the growing attraction came growing consequences. Aaron was torn between his growing feelings for the Queen and his sense of duty to his people. Could he remain loyal to humanity while standing so close to someone whose methods he had come to despise? As their bond deepened, so did the conflict. Within him, would he continue to serve the Queen, losing himself in the power and the allure she represented? Or would he betray his own heart, risking everything for the future of the rebellion and humanity's survival? This was no longer just about politics. It was about the very core of who Aaron was and who he would become. Aaron's every step felt heavier now, each one echoing with the weight of his choices. The Vathari Empire had become a labyrinth of uncertainty, and he, a diplomat, was caught, at its heart pulled in two opposing directions. The walls of the palace, once symbols of majesty and order, now seemed like prison bars. Outside, the rebellion was growing bolder, and inside, Aaron could no longer ignore the suffocating reality of Queen Ilara's rule. She was powerful, yes, brilliant even, but her reign had become a cage, a brutal, Oppressive empire that crushed the very people it was supposed to protect. And yet, Aaron couldn't bring himself to betray her, not yet in secret, away from the ever-watchful eyes of the Vathari court. Aaron met with the rebels. Their faces were cloaked in shadows, and their voices low, as though speaking too loudly, might shatter the fragile silence they existed in. The underground chambers where they gathered were far from the gleaming opulence of the palace above. Instead, flickering holograms and makeshift technology illuminated the darkened space. Advanced Vathari tech had been repurposed by the rebels' tools of the Empire turned against it. What once signified power now served the cause of freedom. But that contrast only deepened the divide between the ruling elite and the oppressed. Every secret meeting chipped away at Aaron's resolve. The rebels spoke of horrors he had never imagined. They told him of the atrocities Ilara's forces had committed, whole villages erased, entire families wiped out, just to maintain the stability of the Empire. It was hard to reconcile the woman he had once admired, the one who seemed to care for the future of the galaxy, with the ruthless ruler they described. Aaron's diplomatic training had taught him that peace was achieved through understanding, through compromise. But as he listened to the rebel stories, his faith in that ideal began to crack. Was he just another pawn in a game of manipulation? A tool to maintain the Vathari's grip on power while they crushed anyone who dared defy them? The thought made him sick. And yet, every time he looked into the eyes of Queen Ilara, every time she spoke with that calm authority that only she seemed capable of, he couldn't help but feel a pang of loyalty. She was the Empire. If he turned against her, what would be left for humanity? But the rebellion was growing, and Aaron could feel the tide turning. The once invisible fractures in the Empire were becoming gaping wounds. The question he faced now was simple, yet impossible. Would he stand by a queen who commanded death, or would he join the forces of change, despite the consequences? Each secret meeting with the rebels made it harder to ignore the truth. The rebellion wasn't just a force against the Vathari. It was a force for something better, something more just. And yet, Aaron knew that siding with them could mean the destruction of everything he had worked to build. His duty to humanity warred with his growing understanding of the Empire's corruption. And every day, the line between loyalty and rebellion blurred just a little more. Aaron had always respected Queen Ilara's brilliance, her strategic genius, her ability to command with authority. But respect had started to give way to something darker, a dawning horror at the lengths she would go to preserve her power. It was no longer just about diplomacy. It wasn't just about the future of the Empire. It was about the price she was willing to pay, and the price Aaron was being asked to pay alongside her. The deeper Aaron delved into the reality of the Queen's decisions, the more his admiration for her began to wither. The stories he had heard from the rebels, the whispered tales of atrocities carried out in her name, were no longer distant accounts. They were real. Whole factions had been wiped out, eradicated in brutal sweeps, just to maintain control over territories that no longer obeyed. The Queen, with her calm and poised demeanor, was a ruler capable of unspeakable violence, a woman whose compassion was lost beneath the weight of her own empire's need for dominance. His growing disgust was compounded by the realization that he too had been complicit. As a diplomat, he had been part of the machinery that allowed Ilara's cruelty to persist. He had helped legitimize her rule, played the role of peacekeeper while the Empire crushed its own citizens. The betrayal wasn't just of the rebels, it was of himself. He had been blinded by her charisma, her strength. She had fooled him, and in doing so, had manipulated him into becoming an instrument of her power. The more Aaron learned, the more the Queen's humanity seemed to slip away. What had once seemed like a powerful vision for the future now appeared as nothing more than a gilded cage. The Vathari Empire was built on the bones of its enemies, and every step forward was at the cost of lives. Ilara's cold efficiency, her calculated violence, was all in service of maintaining the status quo, of ensuring that nothing disrupted the delicate balance she had forged with such effort. The weaponry of the Vathari was unmatched energy-based. Weapons capable of obliterating entire battalions with a single strike, warships that dwarfed anything humanity had ever conceived. These marvels of technology were now used to crush dissent, to enforce a peace built on terror. The power at Ilara's command was awe-inspiring, but it was also terrifying. And as Aaron stood at the heart of the Empire, watching its might displayed, before him, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what he was part of. The Empire's strength was an illusion, a fog held up by fear and oppression. The internal conflict grew, the questions of loyalty and morality tearing at him. Could he continue to serve the woman he had come to admire when he now saw the darkness within her? Could he stand by and be complicit in her rule? The choice was no longer between rebellion and submission. It was between his own soul and the greater good. Every day spent in her court, every decision made on her behalf, felt like a step further into the abyss. Ilara had once seemed like the answer. Now Aaron saw her as the source of the problem, and the growing distance between them mirrored the divide within his own heart. The complexities of Aaron's situation deepened with the arrival of two powerful figures, Tara and General Kale. Each of them represented a different aspect of the Vathari Empire's crumbling power. Tara, a defected Vathari officer, had become Aaron's reluctant ally. She had once been part of the very military that now sought to crush the rebellion, but her defection was a sign of her growing disillusionment with the Empire. She had seen its horrors firsthand, had been part of the machine that kept the Empire running, only to realize that the machine was broken. Tara's knowledge of Vathari tactics, espionage, and the internal workings of the military proved invaluable to Aaron as he began to understand just how deep the corruption ran. Tara's warnings were sharp, her voice filled with the wisdom of someone who had seen the Empire's true face. "You're walking into a trap, Aaron," she told him once, her eyes dark with the weight of experience. "Ilara will use you. She'll make you believe that you're part of something greater. But all she's ever cared about is power. Don't let her manipulate you. You have a choice." Her presence was a necessary counterbalance to Aaron's growing confusion. She was his moral compass, urging him to take action, to resist Ilara's manipulation before it was too late. But as much as Aaron listened to her, the pull of the Queen was still there. He was drawn to Ilara in ways he couldn't explain, and every word Tara spoke reminded him of the darkness that lay in the heart of the Empire he had once admired. On the other hand, General Kale represented everything Aaron despised about the Vathari. Ruthless, cold, and obsessed with control, Kale had risen through the ranks by any means necessary. His power within the Queen's inner circle had only grown, and his loyalty to Ilara was unwavering, except of course when it came to his own personal ambitions. Kale's brutality had no limits, and his growing influence within the military was a threat that Aaron could no longer ignore. The divide between Kale and Tara was stark. While Tara sought to free the oppressed, Kale sought only to crush them, believing that strength could only be maintained through violence. His actions and tactics spoke louder than words, and every new victory he claimed for Ilara came at a greater cost to those who defied her rule. Kale was a man who understood only one thing: power, and his methods would stop at nothing to achieve it. Aaron found himself caught between them. Tara, his conscience; Kale, the embodiment of everything he despised. As the conflict grew, so too did the stakes. He could no longer afford to be passive. Every decision, every step forward, would push him further into this political maelstrom. The path ahead was dark, and Aaron could see that his alliances would soon define not only his future, but the future of the galaxy itself. The city of Nethrix 5 was unraveling, and so too was Aaron's tenuous position within it. The rebellion, once a whisper in the dark, was now a fire raging through the streets of the Vathari Empire. What had begun as covert meetings in hidden underground chambers had grown into something far more dangerous. Aaron could feel the shift in the air, the growing uncertainty as his alliances with the rebels were discovered by both sides. Betrayal was no longer an abstract fear, it was a real, tangible threat. Surveillance drones hummed above the city, their cold, unblinking eyes scanning the streets below. The Vathari military patrolled in full force, their armor gleaming under the harsh artificial lights. Rebel insurgents, though still vastly outnumbered, had become bolder in their attacks, sabotaging Vathari technology, striking at supply lines, and disrupting the Empire's fragile control. The city's infrastructure, once pristine and meticulously maintained, was now a battleground. The conflict was no longer limited to the outer fringes of the Empire. It had reached the heart of Netherrack 5, and it was only a matter of time before it would consume everything. Aaron's covert role had become riskier by the day. What had once seemed like a noble effort to broker peace now felt like a trap. The Queen's forces had caught wind of his involvement with the dissidents. They were closing in, watching every move, every conversation. But even the rebels had begun to look at him with suspicion. Trust had become a commodity too expensive to afford, and Aaron knew that one misstep could lead to his death or worse, the deaths of those he cared about. The weight of his secret grew heavier with every passing hour. He was caught between two fires. On one side, the brutal machine of the Vathari Empire, which would tear him apart if they discovered his betrayal. On the other, the rebels, whose growing strength only added to the sense of urgency. Each side had its own agenda, its own sense of justice, and each was willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve their goals. Aaron had become a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand, but the consequences of failure were becoming painfully clear. And yet, despite the dangers, despite the constant fear that followed him like a shadow, there was an undeniable pull to the rebellion. He had seen the faces of those who suffered under the Queen's reign, people who had been crushed by the very system he had once worked to protect. The Queen's methods were cold, efficient, and ruthless. Her empire was built on the backs of the oppressed, and Aaron couldn't ignore the truths the rebels had revealed. They were not the faceless villains the Queen had painted them to be. They were the victims, fighting for a chance at freedom. Aaron's actions had consequences. Now, consequences that could tip the balance. His role in the Empire was no longer a matter of diplomacy. It was a matter of survival, both for himself and for the future of the galaxy. The choices he made in these moments of hidden resistance would either fuel the rebellion or tighten the Queen's grip on power. The threat of betrayal, from both the Queen's forces and the rebels, loomed larger with each passing day, and Aaron's resolve was stretched thin. The moment had come. Aaron could feel it in his bones. The rebellion was no longer something distant, something abstract. It had become his reality. The Queen's empire was no longer an entity of order and control in his mind. It was a symbol of oppression. The choice he had long dreaded was now staring him in the face. Did he remain loyal to the Queen, the woman he had once admired, even as she revealed the depths of her cruelty? Or did he cast aside the only life he knew, to stand with the rebels, to fight for a future that was uncertain, but one that held the possibility of justice? The tension in his heart had reached a boiling point. The palace, with all its grandeur and power, no longer felt like home. It felt like a gilded cage, a place where power was concentrated in the hands of a single ruler who would stop at nothing to maintain control. Aaron had been part of that system for so long, but now he could no longer ignore the truth. Queen Ilara's vision of the future was one of subjugation, not freedom. Her methods were violent, and her reign had become a ruthless campaign to crush anything and anyone who threatened the Empire's dominance. But the rebellion was different. It was not without flaws. It was raw, unrefined, and it had cost countless lives. But there was something undeniably human about it, something that resonated with the core of who Aaron was, the desire for freedom, for self-determination, for justice. The more he had learned about the rebels, the more he had seen their struggles, the more he understood the cost of the Empire's unchecked power. It wasn't just about defeating the Queen. It was about building something new, something that would give those under the Empire's boot a chance at a better life. The rebellion's victories had emboldened him, but the devastating losses, had torn at his heart. He couldn't ignore the faces of those who had died for the cause. He had seen firsthand the consequences of defying the Empire, and the cost was steep. Lives were lost every day. The choice was not simple. The road ahead was unclear, and the price of betrayal was steep. To choose the rebellion would be to risk everything. To choose the Queen would be to condemn his own moral compass, to sacrifice everything he had come to believe in. The choice, he realized, was not about right or wrong. It was about loyalty. Loyalty to a ruler who had lied, manipulated, and destroyed countless lives to maintain her empire. Or loyalty to a cause, to people who fought for a future built on the ideals he had once believed in. But the stakes were far higher than his own life. This was a choice between two worlds, one where the oppression of the few reigned supreme, and one where freedom was worth fighting for, even at great cost. Aaron stood at the crossroads, the weight of the galaxy pressing down on his shoulders. The tension was unbearable, but he knew one thing for certain. His decision would alter the course of history. Whether he chose to remain in the Queen's service or stand with the rebels, his actions would have consequences. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, but it was a road he had to walk. The weight of Queen Ilara's offer hung heavy in the air, thick with the tension of 1,000 unspoken words. Aaron stood before her, his body rigid, his heart pounding. Her gaze, sharp and calculating, pinned him in place as she made her proposal, each word deliberate and filled with power. Her voice, smooth and mesmerizing, cut through the silence, carrying the promise of unimaginable influence. "Become my consort, Aaron," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "You will rule at my side. Your people will be given a place of honor in my empire. No more struggles, no more war. You will have everything you desire." The offer was a masterstroke of manipulation, an offer that seemed too good to be true, yet carried with it a weight that threatened to crush everything Aaron had ever believed in. The Queen's power was undeniable, her allure intoxicating. She was not simply offering him a position of power. She was offering him a place beside her, in the heart of the empire that stretched across the stars. This was everything Aaron had ever dreamed of, a chance to wield influence, to shape the future of humanity, to end the war. But there was a price, one that he had yet to fully understand. Surrounded by the holographic projections of the Empire's vast territories, worlds, teeming with both wealth and suffering, the Grand Chamber felt both magnificent and suffocating. The opulence of the space, the cold alien technology, the unspoken promise of power, it all swirled around him, threatening to overwhelm his senses. The very walls seemed to pulse with the energy of the Empire, a reminder that the Vathari's reach was absolute. But the more Aaron heard, the more his stomach twisted. The Queen's proposition wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a challenge to his very identity. To accept would mean betraying everything he stood for. He would be forced to abandon his humanity, to give up his own values, his own soul, for the chance at something greater. The question that burned in his mind was simple, yet impossible. Was power worth the cost of his integrity? Every fiber of his being screamed against it. He had come to Netherrack 5 to serve as a peacekeeper, to negotiate, not to submit. Yet here was the most powerful woman in the galaxy, offering him a place at her side, a place built on submission, on loyalty to a system of domination and control. Was it truly the right thing to do, to trade his humanity for power? Her gaze softened for a moment, as though she sensed his hesitation, but there was no mercy in it. "You will make the right choice," she said, her voice both a promise and a threat, "for both your people and mine." The storm of conflicting emotions raged inside Aaron. The choice was clear, yet it was anything but simple. What was the cost of loyalty? And more terrifyingly, was he willing to pay that price? The days that followed the Queen's offer were like a slow, suffocating descent into a nightmare. Aaron could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him from every corner of his life. He had come to this alien world with the hope of forging a path for humanity among the stars. But now, he was being asked to abandon everything: his values, his identity, his very soul, in exchange for a seat at the table of a ruthless empire. Ilara had never been just the queen to him. She was a woman of incredible intellect and power, someone whose sharp mind and steely resolve commanded respect. He had admired her, even feared her, in the beginning. But as they spent more time together, as she confided in him, her vulnerabilities began to slip through the cracks of her cold exterior. He had seen glimpses of the person beneath the ruler, the loneliness, the isolation, the sense of responsibility that weighed on her. And in those moments, Aaron had begun to understand her in ways no one else did, but that understanding only complicated things. The more he saw of Ilara's humanity, the more his feelings for her grew. It was no longer just admiration for her brilliance. It had become something deeper, something dangerous. He had seen her as a symbol of power, but now he saw her as a person, someone trapped by the very empire she had built, and it was that connection that made his dilemma all the more excruciating. He had fought so hard to protect humanity, to maintain his integrity as a diplomat, but every moment spent with Ilara made that resolve weaker. She offered him power, a chance to stand beside her and shape the future of two civilizations. But in the back of his mind, he knew that it came with a price far steeper than he could afford without his feelings for her. Though powerful, or not the kind of love she demanded. She wanted his loyalty, his allegiance, his complete submission to her will. But Aaron's heart lay with his people. His duty to humanity was far stronger than his personal feelings. The rebellion, the suffering of the people, those were his true allegiances. Yet the heart was a dangerous thing, and it could not be ignored. As his connection with Ilara grew, the line between duty and desire became blurred. The Vathari Empire was a machine, cold and unyielding. Ilara had built it to withstand anything, but at what cost? The more Aaron saw of her brilliance, her ruthlessness, and the vulnerability that she kept hidden, the more he struggled with the truth. Could he really betray his people for the chance at such power? Could he truly stand by her, knowing what her empire had done, knowing the suffering it had caused? In the end, the question was no longer about loyalty to the Queen or to humanity. It was about who he was and what he was willing to sacrifice to keep his identity intact. The moment Aaron had been dreading had arrived. Ilara stood before him, her eyes filled with expectation, her expression unreadable. He had thought long and hard about her offer. He had considered the consequences, the weight of what it meant for humanity, for the Vathari, for himself. But in his heart, he knew that the price was too high. "I cannot accept," Aaron said, his voice firm but filled with an unexpected sorrow. "I cannot betray everything I stand for. Not for power, not for you." The words felt like a blade cutting through him. His rejection was not just political, it was personal. He had respected Ilara, admired her strength, and despite everything, had grown to care for her. But what she offered was not a future. It was a prison. A life built on submission, on silence, on the suppression of everything he had fought for. And in that moment, as he saw the flicker of disbelief in her eyes, he knew that he had taken the only path that remained for him. But his defiance came with consequences. As the words left his lips, he saw the Queen's face change. The icy mask of authority faltered, just for a second, and in that brief moment, Aaron saw something he had never seen before, a glimpse of vulnerability. It was not a weakness, but a depth of emotion that shook him to his core. Ilara was not just the Queen. She was a woman, a person, who had been shaped by the very empire she ruled. And in that fleeting moment, he understood her in a way he never had before. "You would reject me ... for them?" Ilara's voice trembled, not in anger, but in something far more dangerous hurt. "You would turn your back on everything I've offered, on everything we could have built together?" The confrontation was a turning point, not just for Aaron, but for their entire relationship. The Queen, who had once seemed invincible, untouchable, was now exposed in a way she had never been before. And as the silence stretched between them, Aaron realized that he had done more than reject her offer. He had taken the one thing she never expected him to, her own humanity. He had forced her to confront the very vulnerability she had spent centuries hiding behind a mask of control and power. Aaron's rejection wasn't just a denial of power. It was an act of defiance against the system she represented. It was the moment he chose humanity, chose integrity over manipulation, and chose authenticity over control. And in doing so, he had broken free from her hold, though not without cost. Ilara's gaze hardened, but Aaron knew the battle wasn't over. The Queen might have been shaken, but she was still a force to be reckoned with. And as Aaron stood there, facing the fallout of his decision, he realized that this was only the beginning. The rebellion, the Empire, and his own soul were now intertwined in a way he couldn't have predicted. Aaron's rejection of Ilara's offer was not the end of their story. In that moment of defiance, when he refused the power she had offered, it became something far more devastating than either of them could have anticipated. It was a betrayal, yes, but not in the way that Ilara had ever expected. It was an emotional betrayal, a rejection that cut deeper than any political maneuver. As the words left Aaron's mouth, the room seemed to grow colder, the silence between them stretching infinitely. Ilara's eyes, once filled with calculated authority, now shimmered with something Aaron had never seen before: raw emotion, vulnerability, and a deep, unspoken pain. The Queen of the Vathari Empire, the woman who had ruled with an iron fist for centuries, was now confronted with the truth she had spent her life avoiding: her humanity. Aaron's refusal was not just about power, it was about love. Or rather, the absence of it. By rejecting her, he had torn away the last shreds of the Empire's illusion of invulnerability. He had struck at the heart of what she had built, not through force or rebellion, but through an act of compassion. Aaron, the diplomat, had taken her heart not physically, but metaphorically, and in doing so, he had forced her to confront the one thing she had feared most: her own emotional truth. For centuries, Ilara had buried her emotions beneath the weight of her responsibilities. She had cloaked herself in the mantle of authority, a queen who knew no weakness. She had been a ruler first, and a woman second, if at all. And yet, here was Aaron, her most trusted diplomat, standing before her, refusing the power she had offered, not out of defiance, but because of his understanding of her vulnerability. He had seen through her armor, through the cold exterior she had worked so hard to maintain. And in that moment, Aaron had made her confront the reality she had spent her life denying. she was not just a queen. She was a woman, alone and yearning. For something she could never have, the love and trust of those she ruled. Ilara's gaze faltered for just a moment, a fleeting crack in the ice that had always encased her heart. The walls of the palace, once a symbol of her power, now seemed to echo with the vulnerability of the moment. The glowing lights that bathed the chamber in a cool, sterile light only emphasized the disconnect between the Empire's technological marvels and the raw, human emotions that now bled through the cracks in her demeanor. That her voice, which had always been strong and unyielding, wavered for the first time in years. "Why?" she asked, her tone barely above a whisper. "Why would? You reject me?" Aaron didn't answer immediately. His own heart was conflicted, torn between the loyalty he felt for his people and the deep, confusing feelings he had developed for Ilara. But the decision had already been made. His rejection was a statement, a declaration that, even if the Queen held the power to shape worlds, she could not control his heart. The technology of the Vathari Empire, so beautiful in its design, now seemed cold, almost oppressive. The advanced weapons, the sleek warships, the energy fields that pulsed with the power of the Empire, all of it seemed hollow in the face of this confrontation. The very things that made the Vathari formidable, these instruments of control and domination, now seemed like a prison. Ilara had built her empire on strength, on the illusion that power could be wielded without consequence. But in this moment, she was stripped bare of that power. Aaron had revealed her humanity, and, in doing so, had exposed her vulnerability. This wasn't just a rejection. This was a challenge to everything she had believed in. For the first time, Ilara was forced to confront the cost of her reign, the toll it had taken on her own soul. The loneliness, the isolation, the sacrifice of her own desires for the sake of the Empire, these were things she had buried deep inside. Aaron had forced her to unearth them. The twist in their relationship, the shift in the power dynamic, was palpable. Aaron's rejection was a breaking point. It was the moment when the Empire's glittering facade began to crack, revealing the emotional depths that had been hidden beneath. It was no longer just about politics, loyalty, or duty. It was about the heart, and in that moment, Aaron had taken Ilara's heart, forcing her to confront the very thing she had spent her life denying. The immediate aftermath of Aaron's rejection reverberated throughout the entire Vathari Empire. What had once been an unshakable monolith of power was now in flux. The walls of the Empire seemed to echo with the dissonance of a ruler who had been publicly humiliated, her authority shaken by the very diplomat she had once trusted most. Ilara, though still queen, was forever changed. The rejection had pierced her more deeply than any physical blow ever could. She had built an empire that spanned the stars, but in the moment of Aaron's defiance, she saw the cracks in the foundation of her rule. The queen who had once commanded with cold precision now found herself questioning the very system she had dedicated her life to upholding. Her control over the empire weakened, and the rebellion, once a distant threat, now seemed poised to exploit the vulnerabilities she had never allowed herself to see. The Vathari capital, which had always gleamed with the light of imperial power, now felt dimmer. The once pristine streets, filled with advanced technology and efficient machinery, seemed somehow colder, as if the very energy that powered the city had lost its vibrance. The humming of the machines, once a symbol of the Empire's strength, now seemed hollow, a reminder of the cost of absolute control. Aaron's rejection had not only undermined Ilara's emotional stability, it had exposed the fragility of the Empire itself. The rebellion, now emboldened by the Queen's vulnerability, began to gain ground. The political and emotional rift between Ilara and her people widened, and the Empire's grip on its territories began to slip. As the cracks deepened, the future of the Vathari Empire became uncertain, and the rebellion grew stronger with each passing day. Aaron had forced Ilara to confront the truth, and in doing so, had set in motion a chain of events that would alter the course of history. The Empire, once built on fear and control, was now facing its greatest crisis, the erosion of the very foundations that had held it together for centuries. And as the tension in the air thickened, it became clear that the consequences of Aaron's defiance would not be limited to the Queen alone. The fate of the Empire, and the future of both humanity and the Vathari, hung in the balance. The Vathari Empire was unraveling. Once a titan, its immense power, built over centuries of ruthless dominance, was now crumbling under the weight of its own corruption. The streets, once filled with fear and compliance, were now alive with the sound of rebellion. The people silent for so long had found their voice. and they were using it to demand a new future. Aaron could feel the shift in the air as he stood among the rebels, watching the once proud city of Netherrack 5 in chaos. The capital, a marvel of architecture and advanced technology, now felt like a hollow shell, echoing with the crumbling foundation of an empire that had lived too long in denial. The towering structures, which had once stood as symbols of strength, now seemed fragile, the cracks in their design mirroring the fracture in the empire itself. Vathari warships, sleek and powerful, had once sailed through the skies, symbols of the empire's absolute control. Now, many drifted aimlessly in space, abandoned or repurposed by the very people they had once oppressed. The rebellion's growing power was visible in every corner of the empire. Technology, once wielded to suppress, was now being used to rebuild. Yet, there was a lingering uncertainty in the air. The fall of Ilara's empire was symbolic, but it left a vacuum one that no one knew how to fill. The people were free, yes, but could they govern themselves? Could they prevent the same cycle of oppression from repeating? The rebellion's flame was both a beacon of hope and a warning. The fires of revolution had burned bright, but the question of what would rise from the ashes remained unanswered. The Vathari people, long bound by fear, had found their strength, but in that strength lay a daunting responsibility. The world they were creating was theirs to build, but the path ahead was uncertain. What would they do with this newfound freedom? Would they forge a fair society, or would the seeds of oppression grow once again? As the rebellion celebrated its victory, Aaron stood at the precipice of a new era, knowing that the future was anything but certain. He had helped bring down an empire, but now the real battle of rebuilding, of forging a new world, was just beginning. Aaron returned to humanity with the weight of a hero's welcome, but the celebration felt hollow. The cheers of his people, their gratitude for his role in toppling the Vathari Empire, rang in his ears, but they did little to lift the heaviness in his chest. He had helped bring an end to a reign of terror, but in doing so, he had lost something. Important, something that could never be reclaimed. The victory, though sweet in its finality, had come at an enormous cost. Aaron had torn apart his soul in the process, his loyalties torn between two worlds, one that had exploited him and one that he had betrayed. The rebellion had won, but in his heart, the victory felt incomplete. The emotional turmoil he had experienced with Queen Ilara still lingered, a shadow that followed him everywhere he went. While the people hailed him as a hero, Aaron couldn't shake the image of Ilara, the woman he had once respected, now alone in the ruins of her empire. Her cruelty had been undeniable, but so had her humanity. The personal cost of his betrayal weighed on him. He had torn away the mask she had built to hide her loneliness and her pain, and in doing so had exposed her raw vulnerability. But in rejecting her, he had also exposed a part of himself, a part of his own humanity he had tried so hard to preserve. As he stood among the people, surrounded by their applause, Aaron could not help but feel disconnected. He had fought for them, for humanity, but the path he had walked had left him broken, caught between his moral compass and the cost of his actions. The rebellion's victory had freed him from the Empire's grip, but it had also left him questioning the true cost of loyalty, of power, and of love. Could he ever truly return to the life he had before all of this began? Or had he, in fighting for a better future, lost something irreplaceable in the process? The celebrations that followed the fall of the Vathari Empire were filled with both joy and uncertainty. The people, freed from the tyranny of Queen Ilara, rallied under a banner of hope. But as Aaron observed the changes taking place, he couldn't help but wonder if this new hope was as fragile as the empire that had just been torn down. The capital city of Nythr, Octa 5, once a gleaming jewel of the Vathari's power, was now a place of transition. The streets, still filled with remnants of the old order, had begun to shift. The former seat of imperial authority was now filled with activists, philosophers, and politicians who sought to determine the future of the Vathari people. Would they build a society based on fairness and equality? Or would they fall into the same trap that had ensnared their ancestors, one of power, control, and fear? Aaron had seen the rebellion's strength, the fire that had ignited the people to rise up. But he had also seen the dangers of unchecked power. The rebellion had the potential to create something better, something more just, but there was no guarantee. In the midst of revolution, in the heat of change, the seeds of a new oppression could easily be sown. The same desire for power that had fueled the Vathari Empire could just as easily fuel the new leadership rising from the ashes. The technology that had once been used to subjugate and control was now in the hands of the people. Holograms, warships, energy weapons, all of it was being repurposed for the rebuilding of the Vathari world. But Aaron knew that the power to destroy was still within their grasp. And with that power came the temptation to use it for personal gain. In the distance, the whispers of revolution grew louder. The people wanted change, but they were uncertain of what that change should look like. Some were already clamoring for more control, more influence, more security. Others called for a new era of peace and equality, free from the oppression they had suffered for centuries. The future of the Vathari people was uncertain. The victory over Queen Ilara had cracked the foundation of the empire, but it had not yet built a new one. Aaron could only hope that the rebellion's success would lead to a better future, but the weight of the unknown pressed heavily on him. He had fought for freedom, but now that it was here, he couldn't help but wonder, was it truly liberation, or just the beginning of a new tyranny? The journey ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. The world was changing, and the price of that change would be paid by all who sought to shape it. As Aaron sat alone, the weight of everything he had done pressed down on him. The rebellion had succeeded, the empire had fallen, and yet the victory felt like a hollow echo in his chest. He had been part of something larger than himself, something that had promised freedom, justice, and a better future. And yet the nature of power had not changed. Whether it was Queen Ilara or the rebels now rising to take her place, power had always carried with it the seeds of corruption. Loyalty, he had learned, was never as simple as it seemed. It was a complex, elusive thing, something rooted in ideals, but always subject to the pull of power. The more he reflected, the clearer it became. No one could remain untouched by the weight of absolute power. Not even the best intentions were immune. The quest for justice, the fight for freedom, these things were important, but they were also part of a larger, endless cycle. The only true victory, Aaron now understood, would come not from the external world, but from internal change, from learning how to navigate the very forces that had shaped him. His journey had shown him the impossible complexity of loyalty and power, and how they could never be fully separated from corruption. What could be gained by defeating an empire if, in the end, the lesson was that power could never truly be conquered? The future of the Vathari was uncertain, vast and uncharted. Sea before them. The empire they had known was gone, and with it, the certainty of their rule. There was hope that the people, freed from the grip of a queen who had ruled with fear, could forge a new path. But there was also doubt, an understanding that the same forces that had created the old empire still lingered within them. Would they rise, reshaped by their struggle, and build something just and true? Or would they succumb to the same patterns of oppression they had once known, creating a new system of control, this time with a different face? Aaron could not know. The question remained unresolved, the future hanging in the balance. There was a quiet optimism, yes, but it was tempered by the realization that the road ahead would not be easy. True freedom, true change, it would take more than the fall of an empire. It would require something deeper, something within the hearts of those who had lived through the reign of terror. As the dust settled, Aaron looked out at the horizon, uncertain of what came next, but knowing that whatever happened, the battle for a new future was only just beginning. Aaron stood motionless, gazing down at the shattered city below. Once a symbol of the Vathari Empire's immense power, it now lay broken, its towering structures reduced to jagged skeletons against the night sky. The stars above, indifferent and eternal, watched over the ruins, offering no answers to the turmoil unfolding beneath them. The city, once so full of life, now felt like a ghost, its heart slowly being reclaimed by the chaos of revolution. This destruction wasn't just physical, it was the collapse of everything that had once stood for the empire. The Vathari people, those who had been its foundation, now stood amidst the rubble of their own past, uncertain of what the future would hold. The streets, once gleaming with imperial pride, now lay darkened and desolate. Holograms that once projected the queen's authority had flickered out, leaving behind only empty spaces filled with the echoes of war. Aaron could feel the weight of this moment, his role in it, the choices he had made that led to this very point. The rebellion had won, but the cost was impossible to ignore. As much as he had fought for this new future, he was haunted by the toll it had taken. The people had been freed from a brutal regime, yes, but the price had been high. The rebellion had brought victory, but also destruction. And now, in the ruins of the city, Aaron could see the uncertainty of what would come next. The power that had once been absolute now lay broken, but with it came the daunting responsibility of rebuilding. The Vathari Empire was no more, but what would take its place? What would the future look like when the Empire's vast technological marvels were stripped away, leaving only the fragile hope of a new beginning? Aaron's leadership of the new alliance between the humans and Vathari rebels was a beacon of change, but that light felt fragile in the wake of such destruction. The city, like the hearts of those who lived in it, needed time to heal, and Aaron was painfully aware that no amount of hope could erase the scars of revolution. In the quiet aftermath of the rebellion, Aaron found himself haunted by memories of Queen Ilara. Her words, once sharp and commanding, now echoed in his mind, both a comfort and a curse. He could still hear her voice, soft and vulnerable for a brief moment in the depths of their private confrontations, moments that had revealed the woman behind the queen, the person she had hidden for so long. His rejection of her had not just been a political decision. It had been a betrayal of something deeper, something they had both felt but could never fully express. The connection they had shared was undeniable, yet it had always been tainted by the weight of the Empire, the cruelty of her reign. Aaron had seen her humanity, perhaps too clearly, and it had torn him apart. But in rejecting her, he had also forced her to confront something she had buried for centuries: the loneliness of a ruler, isolated by her own power. The city below him, the ruins of the Empire, seemed to mirror his own internal conflict. The rebellion had torn down the old world, but in doing so, had left him with nothing but questions. What had he really fought for? Was it the freedom of the people? Or was it something more personal? His defiance against Ilara, his rejection of her offer, had not only broken their political alliance, it had shattered a part of him. He had sacrificed a connection that in another world might have been something more. But now, that connection was a ghost, haunting him in the silence of the city's ruin. He could never go back to what they had, and perhaps that was for the best. But as the stars above glimmered coldly, Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that, in some way, he had lost more than just an empire. He had lost the possibility of a different future, one where power wasn't so intertwined with sacrifice. The weight of Ilara's words lingered, and he knew that the emotional cost of his decision would never truly fade. The dawn of a new era seemed both promising and perilous. The Vathari Empire had collapsed, and in its place, a fragile alliance had been forged between the humans and the rebels. But as the city began its slow process of rebuilding, Aaron could feel the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. The alliance was new, but it was not secure. The same forces that had fueled the rebellion were still present, and the temptation to use power for personal gain had not been eradicated. The streets of HFY were now filled with a mixture of hope and fear. The people, freed from the tyranny of Queen Ilara, were now tasked with building something new. But could they escape the same patterns of control and oppression that had defined their past? Aaron knew that the battle for freedom didn't end with the fall of a queen. It was a struggle that would continue as long as power remained, concentrated in the hands of the few. The technology that had once been used to subjugate now became a tool for rebuilding, but the question lingered. Would the Vathari use this newfound power for good, or would they fall into the same traps as their former rulers? The future was uncertain, and the fragile peace that had been established could easily unravel. The streets of the city, still scarred from the rebellion, felt the weight of this uncertainty. What came next would define the future of both the Vathari and humanity. Aaron knew that his role was far from over. As the reluctant leader of this new alliance, he would have to navigate the complexities of rebuilding, not just the physical infrastructure of the Vathari Empire, but the very fabric of their society. The question of whether true peace could be achieved, or if the cycle of power and oppression would begin again, was one that haunted him. The alliance was just the beginning, and Aaron realized that the true test of their success would not come from victory over a tyrant, but from their ability to resist the same forces that had brought the Empire to ruin in the first place. The unexpected transmission arrived in the dead of night, a sharp ping that reverberated through the stillness of the room. Aaron sat up, his heart racing, as the encrypted message flickered to life on the screen. It was from Ilara Impossible, yet undeniable. Her name was clear in the message header, though the words that followed were far more cryptic, twisting in a way that left his pulse quickening. "Did you ever truly understand me, Aaron?" the message began. The cold precision of her voice, unmistakable even in these few words, made his throat tighten. "My actions ... choices," Were they all for nothing? And what of the love I could never fully express? Was it ever real? Or just a weakness I buried beneath the Empire's weight? Her words struck deep, a direct hit to the heart he thought he had sealed off. His mind raced, memories of their time together flooding back, each one tinged with regret, admiration, and something far more complex. He had rejected her, rejected the power she offered, but now her questions lingered, unresolved. Could he ever have understood her? Could anyone have? The message hung in the air, and for a moment, Aaron found himself unable to respond. Was she truly gone? Was there still more to her story? Something left unsaid between them? The cold hum of the Vathari. Technology surrounding him felt like a distant reminder that the Empire's legacy was far from erased. In this transmission, the advanced tech that had been part of the very system he had fought against now felt eerily alien. But beneath that, there was something deeply human in her words, something Aaron couldn't ignore. He realized then that their connection, once severed, might still have the power to draw them back together. The message was a sharp reminder of what he had walked away from. And yet, it also stirred something deeper, a haunting hope that their paths might cross again. Would he be able to move forward? Or would the ghost of Ilara's last words follow him forever? As Aaron looked out at the vast expanse of stars, the weight of his choices settled heavily on his shoulders. The galaxy, once a place of clear divides, was now a canvas of uncertainty. The rebellion had triumphed, but the battle for a just future was far from over. The stars above, distant and indifferent, seemed to mock him with their endless reach. The alliance he had helped forge, a fragile bond between humanity and the Vathari rebels, was still in its infancy. The future was unwritten, and the struggles ahead were unknown. The Vathari people, once subjects of an empire, now stood at the precipice of something new, but the question lingered, would they truly build a better future? Or would the scars of the past drag them into a new cycle of oppression? Aaron had played his part, but the journey was far from finished. The galaxy was vast, its conflicts as complex as ever, and new challenges awaited. Other factions, remnants of the old regime, or even new threats, would rise. His role in this new world was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: the echoes of the past were not easily erased out as he stood there, the weight of both hope and doubt pressing against him. Aaron knew that his story was far from over. The future lay before him, both a challenge and a possibility, and though the road was unclear, he would continue to walk it. The stars above remained silent witnesses, but to him, they were a reminder that the journey for peace, for true freedom, had just begun.